Okay, folks, we're going to start. It is exactly. Hello? Hi. I'm going to start talking. You'll have your chance. I'm sure people are going to drift in a little bit because that's how we roll around here. But so I wanted to start by saying what we're going to do today, which is that we're going to have a conversation about talking about history to the public, with an emphasis on the parts of it that are not pure joy, but are rather a little complicated and fraught. It works best for me if this is not, in fact, a formal lecture, and by that I mean if you stop me, interrupt me, ask a question. I am not at all disturbed to have the flow arrested, and I would rather have you ask your questions than not. I want to be clear about a couple of things. Talking about how we do it here, and why we do it the way we do. And there are more chairs over there. There may be perfectly legitimate other ways to go at this, but this is what we do here, and it does seem to be working reasonably well. I want to start, because not everybody here knows us well, I want to talk a little bit about the Newport Historical Society and what it is first, but I'll go through that relatively quickly. We are a somewhat atypical historical society in that we are really devoted to the public-facing side of what we do. We are an archive, we are a collection of objects, we have a museum, we have this building which is a study center, and we have historic properties throughout downtown Newport. Sorry, I thought I made you free. A bigger organization than a lot of people are aware. These are our properties. The Brick Market is owned by the city but managed by us. The Colony House is owned by the state but managed by us. We have a lot of resources. And we interact with people in a broad variety of ways. It's not just the museum, it's not just the walking tours. We do lectures, we do publications, we do a lot on the web. We have a museum store, which is also an opportunity to interact with people. And we do have our History Space program, which is our program of costume reenactment. Some of you are very familiar with that. But we are primarily in our orientation a public history organization. So we are thinking all the time about taking the scholarship that scholars produce and in essence translating it and disseminating it to the public. And I should say something brief about public history because you'll hear this term used to mean a whole variety of things that I don't mean when I say it. I don't mean applied history exactly, which is to say I don't necessarily mean history that is being used by politicians to create policy or history that's being used by city planners to create policy, although I think those things are interesting. I don't mean local history. People say public history and they think it means local history. I'm not sure why, but that's a thing. I don't mean local history. We talk about national and international history here. I don't mean history done by the public. There are now training programs in academia to teach members of the public to be quasi-historians. I don't mean that. I mean history done by professional historians and taken by other professional people, i.e. us, for the public. Translated, delivered to the public. That's what we do here. And there are some basic principles for this process. The scholarship has to be good. You have to know your audiences. This is the big defining factor. We're not in a classroom. If I'm a college professor in a classroom, there are certain shared expectations that I can expect from my students. If I am talking to other professors, there are shared experiences and expectations to some degree. We may have arguments, but we have a certain baseline. We've all gotten our PhDs. We've all engaged with the academy. That is not true when you are standing on a street corner with a bunch of people who bought a $20 ticket for a walking tour. And there are certain techniques that are part of doing public history that are, again, different from the kind of things practiced in academia. Our History Space program is probably the most obvious way where we deploy all of these activities. History Space, just as an aside, has two components. One are the reenactments and demonstrations of traditional crafts and trades that we do here. And another side of it is that we organize seminars to talk to people who practice public history about the work. This is one of those. We will often do a bigger one in the spring. We didn't do it this year. We're probably going to do it in the fall. But this is also part of History Space. Okay, so talking about history to the public. Generally speaking, it's complicated. And I think we're seeing that play out in public life a lot right now. People in the past, they were just like us, and yet they were not like us. And that is something that can be really complicated to portray in an hour with 30 people. And it's also something this act of imagination about people in the past is, if you've not studied history or anthropology, can be, that in itself can be an act that's hard for members of the public to make. And we are, at this moment, interestingly for me, living through a culture change that demonstrates how people in the past, and I'm going to say 1970, were both like us and unlike us. And when we look what's happening in terms of public behavior between men and women, we are living through needing to understand that there's been a paradigm shift. And maybe that will make us all a little more sensitive to thinking about the past. The second thing is we almost never have all the facts, right? We have the facts that we've got, we interpret them, we make some decisions about that. And our interpretation may change when we get more facts. So we may tell people something in good faith, and yet it may not be the whole truth. We have to be conscious of that. And historians today have, like any other people at any other time, their own cultural biases and the lens through which they see the past, the present, the facts. So these are pretty high-tony concepts for a walking tour, but we who practice this need to be aware of them.
Ruth, since it's an honor your request and bring up your flow and a request last night that people argue with you, I guess the one thing missing on that previous slide that I often struggle with as a public historian who's trained in the academy is that historians are engaged in a discussion. It's not, people so often think of historians, they think of us as narrative storytellers, when in fact most of us are trained to not do that at all. We are engaged in a discussion about a particular topic or set of topics or region or place. And so I guess my question is, how do you, or how does anybody for that matter, inject historiography, the debate between historians into a walking tour or whatever?
Right. So I'm going to suggest that most of the time you cannot. Right? So in an exhibit, often you can. In a publication, you can. On a walking tour, you can't. So some of this is really context. You can sometimes a little. And I think looking for the opportunity to do that is useful. Again, I'm asking my public historians to have a pretty high level of sophistication in their heads when they engage with the public, because I see this actually as a discipline, as a professional activity. And I do want to say, I appreciate your mentioning narrative, because another difference between academic history today in particular, and public history, is that we are required to create narrative, because without it, the public's just not that interested. And academic history today is actually suspicious of narrative to some degree, because to create a narrative, sometimes you have to leave out some details. I can do that. This is from a quote from Hamilton. One of many of my favorite quotes from Hamilton. This comes up in the musical a bunch of times. This is George Washington talking to Alexander Hamilton. Let me tell you what I wish I'd known when I was young and grew up. You have no control. Who lives, who dies, who tells your story. It's the question of perspective. And it comes up again in the sense of we have the information or we don't, when Eliza's burning Alexander's letters to her. I'm writing myself out of the narrative, she says. People don't get to know how I felt when you broke my heart. We don't have all the data, and we have a crafted perspective based on what we think we know. I think that's perhaps one of the most important things that we need to carry in our minds. So, knowing that, and knowing that we have our biases. We're looking at people who have their biases, who had constructed lenses through which they saw the world. Knowing that historians have claimed to step aside from perspective and bias and that lens, and yet have consistently failed to do that over time. And if you don't think they failed to do it over time, just think about what's happened with, just to use one example, the history of women and women as actors in history. The history that was written in the 19th century implied that women were basically chattel to their husbands up until maybe the 1920s. We know for a fact that was not true. We didn't have the data, or people were not looking at it. Knowing that, it seems to me that there are two ways to look at it. And I since I made these slides, I've had a couple of really great arguments with people in the museums are not neutral movement. I'm suggesting, in a way, that what has trickled down from the museums are not neutral movement is, okay, we have bias, and it's important, and I'm going to tell you all about it. It's been suggested to me that that is a real dumbing down of a very thoughtful, more nuanced approach, and that I actually probably agree with the museums are not neutral people more than I know. But for us, we are actually going to suggest that we recognize the dilemma of bias and perspective, both now and in the past. And we are not embracing our biases. We are trying to examine them, and we're trying to talk about them when we can. So, why do I feel that way? Why do I feel that's important? It has to do with what our audience, who our audiences are, and what they want from us. I'm just going to maybe jump over these slides a little bit. So we're going to try to be honest about the fact that we construct our interpretations through the lens through which we see things. And we're going to be willing to accept new information and new perspectives. And that does come up even on the course of the walking tour sometimes. So, and this is a great debate in American culture and in the history field right now, whether we ought to be judging people in the past by how we see things now. Wherever you fall out on that, we have to recognize that people saw things differently in the past than they do now. And just to suggest that there is something that's constant between the past and now, even throughout all those differences in norms and perspectives. And in fact, this example is illustrative about why thinking about this may be useful to us today, something that I do care about. I'm going to try real hard to not use slavery as an example throughout this, but I'm going to use it here. We would never, right? we would never do anything to participate in something so evil. We're different now, right? We're completely different.
Yeah.
Where's my cell phone? Everybody have one of these? You know what? Slaves mined the materials to make these. Child slaves in Africa. Child slaves in China. Never. There's a way, and by the way, now that I know that, have I thrown this out? No. Have I refused to buy another one? I have not. There's a way of wanting to put distance between ourselves and the past that prevents us from learning the lesson that we need to learn to bring it back to. So our audiences. They bring their perspectives, they bring their biases, they bring the things they thought about and the things they haven't thought about. And all those things are not their fault. It's where they are. And they came to us and they bought a ticket. And they think they know a few things. And they think they trust us. Survey after survey shows that people who engage with history museums and history organizations trust what they're going to be told, at least going in. So we need to think about that too. One of the things that people tend to bring to their engagement with a history organization is a lack of distinction between myth, memory, history, and heritage. They think of the past, think of all the ways in which they look at the past as sort of the same way. This can be a real dilemma. When you start to tell people something that conflicts with what they think they know, you can be really opening up a Pandora's box. It can be extraordinarily unsettling. And knowing that can be really helpful. An example. We had a woman take our walking tour a few years ago and came up to my office afterwards really angry, walked in angry because she had been told something that conflicted with her family story. And this is about the most fraught conversation I have had in a dozen years. So pretty fraught conversations with people, and here's why. She came in and told me that her grandmother was a slave at the breakers. Her grandmother was a slave at the breakers, built after the Civil War. And she had been told stories of this, and she knew it was true because her grandmother had told her. So my response is always, come into my office, have a seat. But our conversation, family lore, what was her grandmother trying to tell her? What might have happened? She did not leave convinced that her grandmother had not been an actual slave at the breakers, but we were able to have a conversation about it. But deeply unsettling to her to come on a tour and be told that the last enslaved person in Rhode Island died in 1853 or whatever. It's something completely destabilizing to a really important family story. And what was I going to do about that? So here's what we know about our audiences. And this is a very recent survey, data that we know specifically. They're primarily older, educated, only 25% are under 50, and 90% are white. They trust history museums. They think history is relevant, and they think that it affects the present. And we know that these statistics align pretty closely with the national cohort of people who come to history museums and take walking tours and do our kind of thing. So what do they want from us? They want to learn. They're pretty clear on that. They're curious. They are happiest, mostly, when they can control or set their own pace. They can be impatient on a walking tour. They like to wander and pull the tour towards their own interests. They do want to touch, experience, and relate. They say they want the facts. They say that they're interested in a variety of perspectives. What don't they want? Or do they not want my opinion? In fact, the woman who did the survey said, I had to put a holy crap column on my data sheet because they don't want my opinion, even to say, Auschwitz was bad. Auschwitz was bad. That was the example. Just give me the facts. I don't want your opinion. I don't want anything that looks like a value statement from you. I just want the facts. Now remember, we started with we don't have all the facts. We build an interpretation. We see the facts through a lens. This is not simple stuff here. And many of our visitors are deeply worried about what they call revisionist history, which they interpret as rewriting history to be politically correct for today. This is this issue of how we see things, how they saw things, what we care about now. And the reality is all history is revisionist history. We rewrite it in every generation. We get new facts, we have new perspectives. This is, for scholars, a very false construct, but we need to be aware that there are people showing up to our sites and to our tours and in our museum who are looking for this. And they don't always have a MAGA hat on. They're watching us for this.
Do you think that, so I'm often struck by the kind of contrast between this versus the trust that people place in museums, and at least certainly on the, never mind, forget politics. Academic historians don't have that trust in the public. So do you think this is in some ways related to what people think it is that museums do?
I
or
do.
public organizations do, I should say?
I do. I think that they think that we are collectors and preservers of facts.
Yeah.
I think we're in an interesting time where a lot of people don't know the difference between fact and opinion. So when they say they want the facts but they don't want your opinion, they're not even sure what they're saying. And I don't mean to demean people by saying that, but I think that is an issue. I also think that we accrue trust because of the tangible things that we have, right? So it's almost a bleed, right? They collect the stuff. It's there. It's real. Therefore, there must be some reality to what they're saying. It's not a particularly accurate construction, but I think we benefit from it. And I don't think we want to blow that either.
No. If I may, a follow-up.
Please.
Do you think, I was thinking about the museums are not neutral, is part of your, well, taking that, we may have a somewhat simplified understanding of that we're working with here, but do you think part of the problem is that that's almost like inviting a little too much conflict and kind of blowing that trust a little bit? Is that part of the issue?
It is for me. I think that that extraordinarily high survey level of trust is a tool that we can actually use to educate people. And let me be clear, I'm Robin Hood here. I want to pretend to entertain you, but actually educate you. I want to not throw my opinion in your face, but get you to think about yours. I want to do all of that. And I don't think we get to do any of it if we destroy the trust. So I think it's important.
Let me push this a little more. So lots of places collect stuff. What distinguishes a museum from those other places that historians make use of is that other stuff tends to be writing. And what we gather as museums are stuff that people don't have to be bothered to read. And so to some extent, is this also about just a general decrease in sort of literacy of anything above a tweet in our society? Or do you think you could get convince people to go out and read and learn as well?
I do think you can convince people.
Okay, so that, I'm sorry, but now you gotta explain that. 'Cause I don't.
So I do, but I think that, because I actually think people are intensely interested in the past. I just think, somebody said something really interesting to me yesterday. She said, Newport has everything, all the cool stuff. We have an art house theater, we have great parties, we have museums, but none of it feels accessible to me. And why is that? So I think it was a really interesting question, and I think that people feel that history isn't accessible to them. But I think when you are able to say, no, it's yours, here it is. Look at people going to Hamilton.
But that's not the same as reading.
No, but it can make people read. How many people read Ron Chernow's book after we met him? A lot. A lot. We sell more books in our bookstore than anything else we sell. But I think that people's expectations for how it goes on their plate is really different than it was 30 years ago. I have been known to yell at people who say things like, these kids don't read anymore. It's a hot button for me.
Wait, you missed an opportunity?
I can do that later.
Okay. I think when we have people come in and ask questions about the museum and the archives, I think archives are very confusing with how to access them. And they just go through them. They think they can go upstairs to Woodland Market and find their family history or that would know it. So I
and by the way, not just go through the papers, but find their family history laid out for them.
So I think that objects in the museum are more accessible because they're more accessible. I think people don't know how to even ask about accessing archives or ask about what they want out of the archive.
Right. I mean, I don't want to hijack this conversation too much, but I guess my point is historians have gone and done that work for you. They've gone into the archives, they've written, they can share. It's just, and as somebody who's taught at university for a number of years now, it is hard to get those kids to read. And sometimes it's a brutal slog. And I don't blame them. I think it comes from a set of education expectations. But I think one of the reasons museums appeal is that it's much easier to look at that beautiful clock than it is to read a 30-page article.
I think that's true, and it's also accessible. It's right there. Look, if we know that more people come into our museum and shop if we prop the front door open, because this is apparently an impediment, then definitely this is also an impediment. So here at the NHS, we've outlined some sort of operating rules. So here are some don'ts. Don't assume that the audience sees the world the way you do. Because in all likelihood, they don't. Don't promote your personal beliefs. We who do this work here we're working for a history organization. We are not working for a political party. We're not working for a political action fundraiser. We're not working for a social justice think tank, although that could be my next job. So your job is not to do those things, even in the face of an invitation to do so. Don't force feed your audience an interpretation, or especially don't assume that your role is to convert. I keep saying we're not proselytizing here. We may be evangelizing for history and the facts, but we have no obligation to concur. It's too much to ask, especially that guy in the MAGA hat. I'm revealing my biases. Don't make people feel guilty or responsible for historical events. It's not a good tool for educating. Some people think it is, but I'm going to tell you it just isn't. Not now. And why isn't it? Because it creates an impediment for people to engage with history. I spoke recently to someone who is a historian, an academic historian of slavery in the Northeast. This person said to me, people in Newport don't want to hear the story. And I'm like, no, actually they do. They absolutely want to hear the story. What they don't want to hear is, oh, you live in the worst place in the world. Oh, you have no idea how terrible. It's not helpful. Nobody comes back twice to get poked in the eye with a stick. And we want them to engage with history because it's important history. So, our guidelines, again, we seek to use the best and new scholarship to inform the stories, the narrative we create for the public. We seek to incorporate all perspectives and to convey to the public that when we cannot incorporate all perspectives, because we don't have the data, not because we don't think it's important. Slavery and slave trade in particular is highlighted very much for us here in Newport right now. We avoid naming and shaming. We avoid calling out the bad guys. We don't think that's the most useful way to tell the story. We'd like to paint a comprehensive picture of how things were and to focus on the stories of the enslaved and their names and their lives and their voices when possible, because we have that information. And in fact, it is the untold story at this point. And we want to encourage people, again, to avoid that distancing, right? If we talk about the bad guys in the past, we can do that, we would never think, right? Those are bad guys. I mean, there were some genuinely horrible people in the past. But slavery was a systemic evil, and we want to talk about that as a systemic evil, not as something bad guys did, Simon Legree with a mustache and they're gone. It's a systemic evil. We still have systemic evils. We want to be able to talk to people about how things happen and how change happens. Okay, so things we ask people to remember when they work for us. People are counting on you to tell them the facts as your institution knows them. That's your responsibility. And I should say, I do believe there are facts. I understand that perspective shapes things so much that the number of things that any two of us share may, the Venn diagram may be small. But here's my proof for why I think there are facts. Real simple. Pass me your book, would you? Just pass it to me. All right, we communicated, right? We agreed this is a book. We agreed there was a pass. There are facts. Use the agreed upon language and the scripts if you have them. If you don't like them when you're given them, argue them. Don't put them aside. Because we're going to ask you to do certain things, like talk about enslaved individuals instead of slaves, like talk about women in a particular way. Don't say women were chattel for their husbands, because we know they weren't. So we're going to give you some language when you work for us. Use that language or argue with me in advance. Don't change on the street. Don't embellish the facts. Don't project. When people say, oh, they must have, I'm like, don't go there. Because if we don't know, we don't know. And pulling our assumptions from now, well, there are some assumptions we can make. People ate. They must have eaten. They had sex. Even Doris too. But you get too much farther than that, and it may not be the case. Distinguish between what we know, what we think we know, and how we interpreted what we know to the best of your ability when you're having a conversation. And remember that people literally may not want to hear your opinion even if they ask for it. I said this before, you're not responsible to make converts. Try hard not to get angry. Be sensitive and let the conversation be over when the visitor wants it to be over, especially when you're giving people new information. They may need to process that. They may not want to go anywhere. It's like a little bit like when your little kids ask you how babies are made. They may want to stop at some point. Don't keep going. Let the conversation be open. And above all, don't get sucked into an argument on the street. You have 25 other people who bought a ticket not to see a debate. So, people may challenge your narrative because they actually know something. And this should make us all a little humble. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. As far as I know today, there were no African descended slaves at the breakers, but I keep my mind just a little bit open. As far as I know today, the stone mill was built by Benedict Arnold to be a mill. Keep my mind a little bit open. People may put facts on the table at some point that change the narrative, and we need to be aware that that may happen. And I think this, this is the place where everybody wants to stop and think, what to do when people are angry. Certainly don't agree to something you know is doing. My technique, the technique we talk about when we do this with our guides is, that's not how we understand it. But thank you for your understanding. And I think this is essential for every organization that deals with the public. There needs to be a safety valve. You need to be able to say to someone, as people here regularly do, if we need to talk about this much, let's get my boss. She doesn't mind. She wants to hear from you. And other organizations use a form that people can fill out or a website that they can go to register a complaint or a concern. You need to be able to give someone an outlet for their anger that isn't in the moment. And organizations that don't have this, I do advise them to set that up. You all who do public history for us are not obliged to also be hostage negotiators. Sometimes it's just an angry person and they need to walk up the hill and see the boss, and that pretty much takes the, by the time they get up to see me, they're rarely still angry. Although there may be a conversation. So this is my conclusion. The NHS tries to be that neutral arbiter, understanding that there are limits to that and we can't be entirely neutral because nothing is entirely neutral. We do it because it's what our audiences want from us and because we think it's the best way to continue to talk to them. And we take a sort of Roger Williams approach to this, which is if we stop talking to each other, we've lost something. So even when I know I'm right, I still want to talk to you. And if you want to talk to me enough to buy a ticket to one of my events, I definitely want to talk to you. So this is, it's core to how we see our mission of talking to the public. We also think that when people disengage from history, when they decide that history has a liberal bias, or they decide that history has a authoritarian bias and they don't want to get engaged with it, we lose that opportunity to have someone think about the present based on what they've learned about the past. And that is a tremendous opportunity and our mission. So we want to try hard not to lose people. So we are non-confrontational. We do let people try to draw their own conclusions. We're willing to talk to them about how you draw conclusions and what's a good conclusion, what's a bad one. Here's an example of a bad one. Gee, this house has the same kind of masonry construction as the old stone mill. Therefore, this house must have been built in 1200, like the old stone mill was. That's a bad conclusion. I'm happy to point out to someone that the logic didn't follow there, that they assumed a fact, not an evidence. But I still want to talk to that person. That is the end of my formal remarks, such as they are. Questions? Concerns?
The Smithsonian African American Community last year, and one of the things that I saw there that I thought about a lot since was upstairs in their popular culture exhibits. They have a little panel or two panels devoted to Bill Cosby, and then you read about him, and there's some TV playing of some of his bits, and then underneath they have an asterisk with what had just come out of Bill Cosby. And then I was thinking too, if Bill Cosby is the only one that I've seen in this whole gallery space with an asterisk, he probably isn't the only one here who deserves an asterisk. And then at what point, if he gets an asterisk, who else gets an asterisk? And it clearly was such an act how they made this panel and this all came out and like they had to address it. But I mean, there are certainly other people up there who have way bigger exhibits on them now who probably deserve an asterisk.
There and elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think that, I'm saying I want to take down this part on Bill Cosby or even maybe Michael Jackson, but, at what point do people get asterisks, or at what point do museums need to point these things out? And is it too contemporary to point some of these things out? And do you need a jury to say these things officially, or is that going beyond being neutral?
If you are committed to tell the whole story, then letting something sit that's no longer the whole story is probably that.
But then, yeah, it's like, why not then have a panel too with Michael Jackson and say what is coming? I mean, at what point do you have to say this about?
You might see that now if you went down it, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are hard, right?
Yeah.
It's called difficult for a reason.
Ask a question that I struggle with in my practice for years now, which is I get sort of the rules as you've laid them out in terms of public history, is it begins from sound historical research. We're not sort of engaging community history. And yet, one of the biggest movements in public history and museum history is just that. It's encouraging community history.
Yeah, I have a real big philosophical problem with that.
Okay, so maybe you can help address it, because at its core, the initial work of community historians very often becomes the basis for what those of us who studied in the academy and learned history. This is an organization that sits in, and lots of us all sit in the middle of Newport. I can't tell you how many times people have come up to me and said, oh, I have stories about Doris too, right? We have some obligation to engage that kind of work, to enfold it into our missions. What are your thoughts on that, especially if they have a big problem?
I think that we do have some obligation to engage with anyone who wants to think about the past and has what they think is data information. I do. Well, where I have a problem is in the notion that myth, memory, and heritage are the same thing as history. I sat in a conference at Brown a couple of years ago, and the chair of the history department said, gee, we historians need to start understanding that we need to start dealing with memory. And my response sitting there was, no, you guys keep doing what you do. Let the anthropologists and the sociologists, let other people talk about memory and culture and heritage. If nobody is going to insist on documentary evidence in constructing history, then we might as well all be Donald Trump. And by that I mean, I thought I saw it on TV that Muslims were tailgating 9/11, and so therefore it must be true because I thought I saw it. And I'm worried about making that distinction. I do believe in facts, and I do believe in the kind of documentary evidence that produces good scholarship, and I don't want to see that distinction blurred. But that does not mean that someone's family memory doesn't trigger an investigation that leads to something. Like, what if that lady came to see me this way? I have no evidence that she was. I don't think she was, but what if she was? I think that investigation is really essential part of this. So yeah, I want to hear people's stories, and I want to investigate them. Go ahead.
I have an example of that. So I work at a museum. We often have locals come in and they want to tell us their story. And we always listen to them and say, well, that's very interesting. We don't incorporate it into the tour unless we think that this person might be right. And then we go back into the archives and we see if
You
we
go
can
look for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, the engagement with the community's memories is an essential part of doing history, but it is not the history.
So I am a docent at Smith's Castle, and one of the proprietors of the castle, the owner of the castle, had, when he passed away, 19 slaves. So when we tell them that, should we go into the who the slaves were? Like, we have a script.
So for me, if I were developing a script for a tour for you, I would say 25 people lived in this house or on this property. Here's who they are. Right? Here's who they are.
Yeah.
And myself, as interpreting a enslaved person, I don't want them to look at me and see just a slave. That word slave. When I interpret them, I want them to be able to see a person who made a big difference in history. So talking about what her duties were and the strength of who these people were that helped, because even though they were slaves in that house, their duties was to keep that mansion going, and so just them being there was a very important part of history in keeping that house standing. So that's how you have to portray it, instead of just saying something, 15 slaves were in this house.
And even just listing their names, right? For me, I mean, we try to tell integrated stories. We try not to tease out the threads. We don't do we will do a women's history tour, but we try to build the fact that women were important economic and legal actors in colonial Newport and subsequently into the story right from the beginning, and the same with people who were here unwillingly from Africa. You know, right in the beginning, start the story with the whole shebang. That's the approach that we tend to take. Now, good scholarship teaches us now that the colonial economy in the North, as elsewhere, was utterly dependent on unwilling labor. Right? Unwilling labor. On the slave trade. Utterly dependent. We were dependent people. So you kind of can't tell the story. Again, good scholarship, right? You can't tell the story without going there. And I think that people ought to be taking a look at the scripts that they give. Their guides and guides should be taking a look at the scripts and going back to the admin and saying, we think something's left out of this. And we're going to hear about it from our guests. If for no other reason, we're going to hear about it from our guests if we don't address this.
You're part of your beginning something to what you're just saying. So I'm here to present facts, unbiased, et cetera,
Oh, I never say that.
No.
I say, here's what we think we know. Here's what we don't know. Here's a story that we think we can tell based on what we know.
Yeah.
And
At the beginning of each tour, would you sort of have a script like, we're here to do this, and you know?
no, we don't have that at the beginning of each
Yeah, I don't
tour,
know.
but I would try to build that sense into the tour when you're shaking your head no and yes.
Yeah, I find as historians sometimes we take too long saying, this is what we're going to tell you, and less time actually doing it. So the more I would more incorporate it.
Just to, again, I'm asking people to hold this in their heads so that they're telling and their responses are guided by this more than sort of delivering it as a treatise to our guests.
I wanted to share, as a public historian, that most of us are very caring, sensitive, lovely people. And we want our guests or our visitors to have a wonderful experience. We don't know what they're bringing to us. So it's very likely that at some point you're going to offend someone with something you said. And we beat ourselves up over that. Oh, I shouldn't have said that word, or I shouldn't have said it this way. Don't beat yourself up. It's going to happen. You have to graciously learn how to kind of back it. So that's number one. And one thing, Ruth, I'll disagree with is, I like to present the facts, but then I think the public is coming to us, they want to know, they'd like to know, well, what do you think these facts mean? So when we're standing in Godzilla Acre, and we're looking at a stone that was paid for by the white owner, I don't want those people to walk away thinking they were so loved by their owner, they bought a stone for their enslaved African. So I like to say, we don't believe this is it, but we think it might have been a sign of
So
prosperity.
you are in modeling, actually, you're not disagreeing with me at all, you're actually modeling exactly what I want you to do. Which is, this is what we know, this is what we think we know. We can speculate that this may have been the case. That's different from my opinion is.
I noticed that and wanted to recognize that Newport had a history of enslaved people that were so important to the economy and its identity and all.
And the culture and pretty much everything.
That now, recently I hear Newport was the biggest slave trading port in all of New England. Newport was the most active slave trading port, and I hear this and I think some people, I can tell the question on the tour, now wonder, well, where were the thousands of slaves auctioned off, or where in Newport?
Right, okay, so this is a
So
great,
it has to be qualified, or somehow a statement like that is very general.
this is a great example of the dilemma, right? This is,
brought somewhere else.
this is a perfect example of people bringing their own stereotypes and their own, the knowledge they think they have to the table. And it's a great flip side to the people who say, there was slavery in the North. I get as much of this, where was the slave market? There must have been, right? Because I am hearing from people that Newport was very active in the slave trade, and then there therefore must have been a market. So this is the case where we know what we think we know, and it is also the case that we are always looking for more information. There does not appear to ever have been a standing market in it. And the reason for that is that Newport was an economic center for the slave trade and a shipping center for the slave trade, but it was not a center for the trade in enslaved humans. Ships went to Africa, they took their cargoes from enslaved individuals to the Caribbean and to Charleston. However, we also know that there were more enslaved people living and working in Newport who probably came here up from the south in 2s and 3s and worked in most of the trades, and without them, there would be no thriving economy. So that's a very complicated thing to have to explain to someone, and often it conflicts with the stereotype that they're carrying in their minds. So you have to be really deliberate and careful about these are the facts as we know them. Another great example of that is, was the colony house built by slaves? I have a canned answer for that, and it goes like this. If I say yes, are you picturing the Jews in Egypt building the pyramids with overseers with whips? Because then the answer is no. A group of highly skilled bricklayers built the colony house. We know their names. We know how much they were paid. We can infer from those names that about half of them are of African descent. They were paid too. We don't know if they got to keep that money. We don't know if they were enslaved or free. That's what we know.
I find that with these questions, of course, we've remarked a lot about slave market, and I find that people often are almost trying to bait you to think you're trying to revise.
I think you're trying to,
or like make it seem like where you're working isn't that bad. And what I found is the best way to usually have a conversation is to first kind of meet them somewhere that they agree with for sure, like, isn't it, we know, of course, slavery was here, and we let her know you shot. And then they think that you're on their side, and you can kind of tease out the right information and kind of tell them the truth. But usually, they want to have like a knee-jerk reaction to the
Well, they brought their assumptions to the table. They're not, I mean, I would suggest they're not actually trying to bait you. They're suspecting that they can't trust you.
Yeah.
And they have a set of assumptions that they bring to the table. And
So you're on the same page as them, yeah.
so another great question, so slavery wasn't so bad here. Pretty sure if you're enslaved, it's all bad. That's my answer to that. However, the picture that you have of the institution of slavery is probably based in the antebellum South, and that's not what it looked like here. Right? So you're recognizing, you're honoring, not honoring, but you're recognizing the bias, the picture that people bring to the table, and then asking them to shift it.
I think what you're saying is very, very correct in all aspects. But I feel that when you talked about language, that's the most important piece when you talk about slavery. What your language is, how you interpret your language. For example, when I ever talked about slavery, it was always, this one was slave, that one was slave, blah, 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 all just slave. And then about 8 or 9 years ago, I heard a new word, enslaved. I'd never heard that before. I'm very serious. I think I'm educated, but I never heard enslaved. And I said to myself, well, that's a guilt word. It's just being used, it's being whitewashed, because slavery is slavery. Enslaved softens that aspect, just a teeny bit. Some people think so. Okay? It's taken me a while. I'm willing to accept that. If that is what people would like to say, that's fine. That's great with me. That's fine.
So Vicki,
I'm willing to do that.
you are pointing out the difficulty of language policing, right? And we're slow to adopt language policing here for that very reason. Here's another example that has nothing to do with slavery. We did an exhibit at the Antique Show a few years ago, and we called the first European arrivals to Rhode Island immigrants. And if there's an issue right now that is as fraught as the issue of the history of race relations in this country, it's immigration. And I had a donor to this organization come up to the front desk in a state of rage because I had called his ancestors immigrants. Right? So I was like, would you rather me call them colonists? Another very fraught word. And we had a conversation, and again, I don't think he left me happy, but he understood. We are trying to use words and not adopt the politicization of words. I like enslaved Africans better than slaves because I'm trying to focus on the people, right? I like even better, if we have their names, to just use their goddamn names.
But I also like the word that you said, unwilling.
Mm-hmm. Unwilling labor.
Right, unwillingly.
I think you've heard me talk about that before.
Totally appreciate that. Because I think at the same time, when the colony house was being built, the Irish and the Africans worked together.
That's right.
And many of them worked unwillingly. And we don't know which Irishmen, and they could have been enslaved.
Probably not, maybe not Irish. Probably not Irish, but certainly European descent people worked on their colony house. And we don't know how willing they were. That is true. But they were not enslaved in the same way. That, they're
Enslaved in the same way, so therefore,
complicated.
yes, very much.
History's complicated. That's how I started. Any more questions?
You mentioned at one point, maybe I misheard, not to mention names, and I wondered what you meant by that.
Oh, I was talking about we don't name and shame. And what I meant by that is we try not to focus on, here are the bad guys. 2 reasons for that. Probably more than 2, but 2 that I'll say today. One is, again, you're focusing on the enslaver and not the experience of being enslaved. You're using a perspective of the dominant culture only. Here are the biggest slave owners. Let's make a list of them. They were bad guys. ignoring the fact that the people they enslaved actually were essential to the story's history and probably deserve as much, if not more, telling. So there's that. But we also feel that that focus on sort of the guilty parties, becomes an impediment for people to engage with the history, right? Like bad guys, good guys, we're all good guys here. Somebody, there's a great quote, and I have no idea whose it is, that says that so much evil is done in the world by people who assume they're good people. So we just think it's not a useful perspective. I talk about the movie Traces of the Trade, right? Traces of the Trade is made by a woman, Katrina Brown, who discovers that her ancestors, who she thought were extraordinarily admirable people, were actually the DeWolfs of Bristol. Not so good,
Exactly.
right? So, but that should have meant nothing to her, right? That if I am guilty of the evils that were done by my ancestors in the past, am I also the beneficiary of any good they did? No. I think this perspective it does not encourage us to think about our own behavior. It encourages us to think of, is to make the world into bad guys and good guys. And I just am not a fan. So when we do walking tours, we don't say, there's Abraham Redwood, he was a slave owner. There's this, because they all were. They all were participating. We need to think about it more holistically. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit. But I once had 2 graduate students from Brown, who should have known better, walk into the archive, walk in to ask for an archival appointment, and they said, so we want to see everything on slavery. So my response was, literally, that would be everything. You're gonna have to be a little more specific. The more notable, interesting thing to do is to highlight the people who tried to extract themselves from the system. The people who early on said, how can we talk about soul liberty and still enslave people? The people like Benjamin Lay in Philadelphia, who went and lived in a cave because he was trying to extract himself from the economic system that slavery made possible. Much more interesting for me to focus on those people. And I am revealing a little bias when I say that.
I would just contribute that in my experience, this idea applies to the good guys as well. Done a lot of work on abolition, both pre and during and post-war. And my message is always that it wasn't just like Abraham Lincoln who set me free, or who ended slavery. It took the work of literally thousands, tens of thousands of individuals, both enslaved and not, making just sort of everyday decisions, and that's how it gets done. And I generally think that ends up being a more hopeful message than just the sort of
It gives people a certain sense of a roadmap for social change today, if you believe that social change has any value. I always say about the abolition movement that the question isn't why it took so long, the question is why it happened at all. Because when your cultural norms and your economic self-interest, back to the cell phone, encourage you to accept how things are, it takes a big leap to go live in a cave. And I think that, as we think about things that are happening now that we know are wrong, but that are embedded into our lives, just to use a really trivial example, maybe not so trivial, the factory farm, the chicken processing plant. It's a moral outrage. Anybody who walked into one would feel that way. And yet, Chick-fil-A here would come. If you think about what it would take to make the change, it's as you said, it's 1,000 little decisions and a change in the system. Why did abolition happen in the North and not the South? We're not better here. It was economic. The Industrial Revolution happened here and helped make it possible. Also, the system made people really terrible in the South. The system itself.
Me and Shane and I walking through, if you have anybody who's from South and Mason-Dixon line, it really is a way to make people feel like they have to be considered.
Well, this is like the people coming into Newport and saying, this is the worst place in the world, this is the major, this is the biggest, it was the worst, you were all terrible. It makes an impediment. They'll walk off the door. I mean, I should say I'm really hopeful that the gigantic database that is our history can inform us to make a better future. It's why I do the work. And I think it's at the bottom line of all of this. We consult that data. We might make some better decisions about what works and what doesn't work. And that drives my sense that we want to not lose people when we do the work. You should all stand up. You must be very sore.